Another day, another Cinema 4D update. At least that's what it feels like. And it's time to say unironically that this update is fire. Literally. That's right, the new C4D particle-based simulation system now has the ability to generate fire, and you can finally unleash your inner pyromaniac natively inside of Cinema 4D. So is the new update straight fire or a dumpster fire? Let's find out. Also, if you'd like to follow along, you can download some of the project files I'm demoing here, and that link is in the description below. So Cinema 4D's new fire simulation system is called Pyro, and it's built off of the new particle-based simulation system introduced back in Cinema 4D S26, along with cloth and rope simulations. So what can Pyro do? Well, it can create super detailed fire and smoke simulations or more stylized fire and smoke sims. And it can also create explosions. Whoopee! And it's built on that unified simulation system, so that means you can set fire to cloth, soft bodies, and use rope and colliders and all that good stuff. So does this new Pyro system have that, Cinema 4D-ness, that ability to do complex things super easily? Well, to set either an object or a spline on fire, you can set both of those types of objects on fire. All you gotta do is create the object, right-click on that object, go to Simulation Tags, Pyro, let's just zoom out here, and we will hit play, and just like that, in 2 clicks, you have fire. So easy a caveman can do it. Now, Pyro generates an open VDB volume, much like the volume builder. And the Pyro object here is also generated at the same time. So we got our Pyro tag and our Pyro object. You can see that the Pyro object, what it does is it holds all of the scene-wide data and settings that the Pyro tag is generating. And more on that in a little bit, but you can see there's settings for days here in the Pyro object there. But if I move around my sphere here, you can see that this is really fast and looks really awesome in the viewport. But the thing you have to understand is that this viewport is just a representation of the VDB as it's calculated on the GPU. So if I were to say render this frame, you wouldn't see anything at all because this is actually rendered on the GPU and not actually in our viewport, hence why this is so fast. More on that whole thing later. But let's go ahead and let's start having some fun with the Pyro here. And let's go to our Pyro tag and let's just talk about some of these settings here. Now, I said there's settings for days, but if you learn just what a few of the settings do, you'll be ready to go. So first things first, 2 of the most important settings here, and 2 important things to understand, is density is referring to smoke. If I turn off the density, that's actually going to turn off the smoke altogether, and we're just going to be left with the fire. And the fire is actually just the temperature here. So if I turn off the temperature, no more fire. If we have density, we just have smoke. And you can see that we actually don't have any of the flame kind of pushing that smoke, so they kind of work in tandem. But just to say that you can render out the smoke by itself or the fire by itself as well. I'm just going to leave on both of the density, the smoke, and the temperature, which is the fire, all together, just so we can see what this looks like. On the temperature, we have these 2 options. Set is the set temperature, so however hot that fire is. So if I bring this up to, say, 10,000, that's super hot. You're going to see that billowing up and almost look like an explosion because how hot that is. It almost looks like lava. And if I bring this super low, like 500, let's just rewind here, you can see that not a lot's going on. If I turn off the density to turn off the smoke, you can see that just a little bit of heat is here. It's kind of like when your campfire is just kind of cooling off and cooling down and getting put out. You only see a little bit of those embers, right? Because there's not a lot of temperature. So same thing here. If you go low enough, you're just not going to get anything at all. So the default, if I right click on these arrows here, that's 4,000. We can bring this down to 2,000 and you can see we got a slower burning kind of flame going on there. I'll reset that to default. This add is basically, I don't mess with this very much, but it's the amount of temperature that's added after the initial frame. So if I go to, say, 10,000, not 1,000, 10,000, not 100,000, there we go. You're going to see that that doesn't really generate all that much. It's kind of like that first frame, and that's about it. So again, I really don't mess around with the add. too much at all. The most important thing is just this set. And then of course we have the velocity. So how fast is that sim moving? So this is set to movement. And this is actually kind of funny because if you look at this strength here, it's set to 100. Let's do 200 just so it's a little bit more noticeable. But you'll see nothing actually happens with this flame. What you'll see is that when this is going from side to side, that when it stops, the flames go to the left and then stop, go to the right. We got this explosion. Something that's pretty cool is if you put like a negative number in this set to movement. So again, it's set to the movement of your object. So if I move this like this, you can see this is more like a rocket booster or something like that. Like the flame is actually getting pushed and it's propelling. It looks like it's propelling this sphere, which is pretty fun. So you can see how that looks. So if we bring that back to 200, you can see what that looks like. It's more like a Hadouken or something like that as the flame stops. So just something to mess around with there. Now, another thing that's cool is you can actually just set the absolute velocity or add to velocity, and you can choose the direction. So either positive or negative X, Y, or Z. So if I hit play here, you're going to see that we are just in positive Y. If I go negative Y, you can see that nothing's really happening because we're adding to velocity. What we want to do is set absolute velocity. And you can see what's going on there is it's trying to go and fight gravity there. Let's do 500. Now you can see that it's pushing, trying to push it down, but it's still fighting gravity because if I hit Command and Control D, you can see in our scene settings, there's gravity right there. We can turn off gravity altogether. And now we don't have gravity kind of impeding anything. You can see the fire is actually inverted. It's going downwards. Maybe this is, you know, an upside down world where everything is opposite. It's like opposite day world. But we'll turn back on the gravity there. And let's go back to these settings here. So if we wanted this to say, turn another direction, let's zero this out. And direction, let's go positive X. So we're going to have this like flamethrower kind of thing to the right here, or the positive X. Let's go 1500 or 1510. That's very specific. You can see we got this like flamethrower, which is super, super cool. And again, this is a unified simulation system. So we can go and bring in poor Bob, the figure guy. He's going to get Dracarist here. But let's actually make this sphere a little bit smaller. Again, I'm going to reiterate it. I do this every single like dynamics tutorial. Be sure to keep tabs on your scene scale, the objects, what their scale is. You can see how big this sphere is. If we were like I guess, you know, this would be the mouth size of like a giant dragon or something like that. But if you wanted to have Bill light a match or something, like the actual light source or the fire source would be super, super small if this was a match head. Okay, so just keep in mind scene scale because I can duplicate this sphere and make it small. Let's bring this over there. And you can just see the type of flame you're getting, okay? So scene scale, super important with any simulation, especially now with this Pyro. That's like a candle flame. This is a giant dragon flame, okay? So let's make this sphere a little bit smaller. We got Bob, the figure object here. He's not going to have a good day because what's going to happen, he's going to get Dracarist here. But you can see that there's no interaction with the flame there. And again, because we have a unified system, I can go in here, go to simulation tags, and that collider will also work for the Pyro here. So I'll grab a collider here, and now we got this Dracarist, and you can see that now Bob the figure guy is interacting with the flame here, acting as a collider, which is pretty cool. To make this even more apparent, let's grab a plane object, make it a little bit bigger, and we'll just drag and drop that collider tag to that plane object, rewind, hit play, and now you can see that flame hitting that plane object. It's like a shield or something like that, getting pushed back there. And this is just so much fun because this is how this performs in the viewport here. So let's go ahead, let's delete that plane object. Let's go to our Pyro tag and let's turn off temperature and let's just turn on density and let's hit play. Let's play around with some smoke here. And you can see all this really cool smoke blowing there, looking really nice. let's actually go and let's move this sphere over here. And the cool thing about the density here is we can actually choose a set color. So maybe we want to get a little stylized here, maybe a little obnoxious pink for this this color. Cool thing too is you can actually like animate the color as well. If you want to change that to yellow, you can see how that kind of mixes. So let's go back to pink, obnoxious pink, very bright. And then I'm going to go and rewind, command click and drag, duplicate this sphere. And for this sphere, I actually want the smoke to go in the negative X direction. So I'll go -1. So now what we'll have is 2 spheres emitting smoke. And let's actually bring this color to like, and you can see all that smoke going right there, which is really cool because now the smoke mixes and all that good stuff. So really, really fun. And another cool thing is, I'm going to talk a little bit about like how to stylize these looks. So you're not just getting like super realistic fire, super realistic smoke. I'm going to show you how you can actually color your smoke differently, color the fire differently. So if you want a blue flame or a purple flame or anything like that, and remap those color values, but I'll show you a little bit about that later when we get into Redshift. So one aspect of the Pyro tag, I'm just going to select both of them, is this noise strength. So if I up the strength here to like 50, you can see that that's basically creating a little bit of noise that's controlling how much turbulence there is in our smoke. If I go and turn on temperature here, this will be a little bit more obvious. You can see the noise scale. If I move this down to say 2, you can see the smaller noise happening there. So again, this is really important when it comes to scene scale as well. We've got some big noise, and we got some even this noise frequency, which is the animation of the noise. So you can see if I up that number, you can see the noise is really going crazy, and we're getting this really cool kind of flame going on there. And if we go back to, this is really cool. If we go back to our, let me just reset these to default by right-clicking on these arrows. Let's go back to the smoke here. One thing that is super, super cool is, of course, you can use colliders, you can use all that stuff. You can use field forces and forces. So all those fun forces, you played around with the cloth dynamics and all that stuff, you can use them here as well. So let's go and let's grab some rotation. And the rotation is going to be rotating along that Z-axis there. And actually, I got gravity. I don't want gravity. I want rotation. There we go. And now you can see stuff rotating there. It's like getting sucked in, which is super cool. So again, this is rotating along the Z. So we get this cool circular motion there. But if I rotate this up, so positive Z is facing upwards, and let's get this rotation. Let's really crank up this angular speed. Maybe too much. That's too much. Go down to 30. You can see if you go too fast, you're getting these like big particles and everything kind of gets lost. So you can see what's going on there. Got some spinning. What we can do here is use a field. Let's grab a linear field. So the field force is only going to happen. Actually, let's make sure we got the linear field, not grabbing the rotation there. So just grabbing the linear field, bringing that up. So what should happen is there will be no rotation below until it gets up here and should start spinning. But how do we push these smokes to go up? Did I just call them smokes? I called them smokes. How do it's smoke. It's just smoke. That's the plural. Let's go and let's grab a forces. Let's grab a wind. And again, this is going to be directing upward. So I'll rotate this upward. So the positive Z is the way the wind is going to be blowing. Go to wind. Let's go and up the wind speed here to say 30. And so this is going to, I think we need more than that. So sometimes you just need crazy values. And now you can see the wind's kind of pushing upwards. And now we got this like cool vortexy thing. Let's maybe make these spheres even smaller and closer to the rotation there, so you can see what's going on. Now, what if we didn't want the smoke to dissipate so quickly? What if we wanted the smoke to, stick around for a while, kick its heels up? Well, what you can do for that is going into your Pyro object here, not your Pyro tag. These are scene-wide settings in this Pyro tag, kind of like how you have localized simulation, like cloth simulation tag on the object, but you can also go and hit Command or Control D and go to the scene-wide simulation settings. It's the same thing for this Pyro object here. So these are the scene-wide Pyro settings. And if we go down here to this dissipation, this is what's controlling how fast the fire dissipates as well. So if we don't want the smoke to dissipate as much, or at a type of rate, I can bring this down to 1%. You can see that that smoke is going to be lasting a lot longer, and we can start to see this kind of vortexy thing happening. Let's really up the vortex there. So 50. Let's bring the wind up to maybe 6.5, and there you go. Maybe add a little turbulence in there as well. We got this like cool little vortex thing with like literally no time. We're just kind of messing around here, right? If we go back to this Pyro object here, let's see what else here is cool. Now, one thing I absolutely love, and I talk about stylized looks. Well, if you don't want things to be so realistic, check out this smoothing factor. So we have the temperature smooth factor, which by default, this is on at 100% for the fire. But if we bring this up 100% for our smoke, see how that just kind of smoothed out? And this kind of looks like a lava lamp, actually, like an ink kind of thing. And I wish this went above 100 because I'd like to smooth that out even more. But you can just see what type of different looks you got just by upping this smoothing. Now, there's also these different thresholds here, which kind of remove some of the that volume that's being created. These little thresholds, which is really interesting if you want to like cut off some of the like the lighter values there, and just so the darker values in that voxel or the stronger values in that voxel is being used, you can totally do that. There's a velocity threshold too, which kind of makes things go slower. And then there's also the velocity smooth, which is also something that is kind of interesting, where it just kind of slows stuff down a little bit. Look at that nice wispy smoke there. So just so many settings. Again, the smoothing and the dissipation are ones that I find myself using a lot. There's also the turbulence. If you want to really crank up the turbulence in there, you can see how much more detail you have in there as well. The frequency of that strength, all that good stuff. And there should be like there could be a whole course on just these settings here. And hey, speaking of courses, if you want to learn more about our 3D courses, including Cinema 4D Ascent, taught by yours truly, head on over to schoolofmotion.com. There you can see all of our current offerings, and keep it tuned to School of Motion because we're working on some new courses. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Let's dive back in. Now, if you're used to working with the volume builder and the volume mesher, you're probably familiar with the concept of voxels. For those of you who may be new to the concept of voxels, voxels are basically 3D pixels here. And just like pixels, the smaller the pixel or smaller the voxel, the higher resolution image or object you can get using voxel. So as I lower this voxel size, you can see here's our sphere VDBs that are being generated with our volume builder here. Now, why this is relevant is when you are making any fire or smoke sims using Pyro, Pyro is actually generating voxels just like the volume builder to be able to depict that sim. So just like we lowered the voxel size to get a higher resolution volume of our objects here, to get a higher resolution sim using Pyro, we're going to have to lower the voxel size here as well. But there's one gotcha. There are two areas to change your voxel size. Number one is in the Pyro tag, you have the object voxel size, and then you have the scene-wide Pyro voxel size in the Pyro object here as well. And that's, kind of confusing. Why are there two settings? And how this was explained to me by the awesome nose man over at Maxon is that you can kind of think of the object level voxel size that live within the Pyro tag as the size of your Photoshop brush. So if I have a very small Photoshop brush, let's just say we'll move this down to 1 centimeter so we can get fine details drawing that. But the other aspect of it is your Photoshop document resolution, which you can think of the voxel size in the Pyro object as that resolution of your Photoshop size. So if we have a very finely detailed brush, but our Photoshop document size is very low res, Like this voxel size is actually pretty large. It doesn't matter if we used a finely detailed brush, our image is going to be very low res, and you can see that represented right here. But if we have our finely detailed brush, like this 1 centimeter here on the object level, and we also have a high document resolution, aka a small global voxel size for our sim, so you can see that that is the big difference between your voxel size globally and your voxel size locally on your objects. Now, the smaller the voxel size, the more VRAM it's going to use to generate and store all of these voxels that are being created. And so this is very dependent on your GPU setup and the VRAM that you have on your GPU, because if you don't have like a very beefy GPU, you could run into errors that Cinema 4D can throw up occasionally, right on cue, that says you've used the maximum amount of VRAM allocated. So what a good workflow is for that is do all your sims at a, fairly higher voxel size here. And once you're done with the sim, you could always lower this back down. You can even go to like 0.5 and then just go ahead and cache that sim. Okay, so as long as you're working, you should probably use a higher voxel size. And then, of course, when you're going to render, you can bring down that voxel size as well. Make it a smaller voxel size. Now, one other thing I wanted to show you is, if we go to our object voxel size and we say, we're using a very large Photoshop brush here, it's going to be very low res. As long as our voxel size on our project level is low, you're still going to get highly detailed sims. So it's like I'm painting with a very large brush. Those big paint strokes are going to be pretty high detail as long as that voxel size is small. Okay. So hopefully that clears up the difference between your global voxel size and your local voxel size. You're not going to get a highly detailed illustration by using a very broad, fat brush like we're using currently. So I'll bring this down to, let's just say 3. And then I'll go to my Pyro voxel size for the document there and give that a 2. And so now we got something running fairly decently fast in our viewport, and we still can see all of that detail. Now, speaking of voxels and volumes, whenever you generate voxels using a volume builder, you can always go ahead and mesh it, and that is something that you can go ahead and render. You can actually do the same thing with voxels created using the Pyro sim system. And this is one of the best parts about having this whole Pyro system integrated in Cinema 4D is that it can take advantage of most of the tool sets within Cinema 4D. So you saw how I used forces along with it. We can also throw this Pyro object inside of a volume mesher. Now you're going to see that as I threw that Pyro object in the volume mesher, nothing happened at all. And remember back at the beginning of this video, I said that whatever you see in this viewport is not actually existing within the C4D viewport. It's on your GPU, and that's how it can offload that calculation to speed up your viewport view. So what we have to do to bring this sim and load it into our viewport here is by going into your Pyro object, going to the object tab, and this is kind of like your stoplights here. Like, is this visible in render? Is this visible in your viewport? Here we have 3 different settings for different aspects of our sim. So remember, density is your smoke. Color is the actual color from your smoke or your fire. Temperature is, remember, is your fire. We got fuel. Velocity is if you want to store the velocity and use it to, say, advect particles. And then you have pressure and divergence. By default, most of these are just off altogether, but the most important aspects here are the density, the temperature, and the velocity. Now, for our purposes, we don't even need velocity to be represented at all, but what on export means is that this is going to be simmed on your GPU and not live in your viewport until you go and cache it. And once you cache it, it'll generate a VDB, and then it can actually be loaded into your project. But if you don't want to cache something out to be able to see it, we can just change this from on export to just on. And what this means is that this is going to get loaded into your viewport. As you can just see, some stuff changed, and it's going to actually load. Let me just turn off the volume mesher for now. It's going to load this in my viewport, and there's all of the voxels there. You can see the color as well. And this is actually now living in the viewport. So with all these voxels here, I should be able to turn on my volume mesher. And as I click on the volume mesher, you can see a very small little object there. If I adjust the voxel range, and this is now a mesh that you can actually, render. If you wanted to smooth it out, you can just go and grab hit Shift C, a smoothing object. And we're going to place that right in the same hierarchy as the volume mesher and the pyro object. And now we can kind of adjust the amount of smoothness here. And now we can go and hit play. And you can see that this is only being generated when I stop the playback. How to fix this is by hitting Command or Control D to go to your global project settings, going to simulation, going to scene, and then checking on the simulate before generators. And what that's going to do is it's going to simulate your sim before any generators, i.e. your volume mesher. And now you can see this cool kind of liquidy simulation. And this is just such a really, really cool thing that you can mesh your pyro sim, and you can kind of get the sense of a fluid simulation kind of thing, which, hopefully is on the way to come for future Cinema 4D releases. But this is just really, really awesome to be able to do stuff like this. All right, so I hope you've been really digging this whole intro to Pyro thus far, and we've just barely scratched the surface. We haven't even gotten to how to render all this beautiful sim stuff inside of Redshift, which we will get to. But before we do that, we'd really appreciate if you would like and subscribe. Doing so really helps us out and will alert you anytime we drop hot and fresh content. So if you're digging our videos thus far, consider subscribing. Please, please do, because if you don't, I'm gonna get fired. See a little fire joke? All right, well, they're gonna fire me for that really crappy pun. All right, so here we have a fairly basic flaming sphere, which I'm sure we're gonna see a lot of as people start playing with Pyro, but a lot of these settings are fairly default. One of the things I changed is the voxel size on the Pyro object, as well as the Pyro tag here. You can see the voxel size a little bit lower. And then just up the substeps to 1, it's gonna have a little bit more accurate simulation, more detail. There's just so many settings here to get into, but just to show you that this looks really great with close to default settings, or even fully default settings. But we got this going on here. We want to use Redshift to render this. So let's first go and let's change our renderer to Redshift. And if I go to my Redshift menu here, get Redshift render view going, we just dock this to the side over here, and let's fire that up. And we got a sphere. No fire though. But if you'll remember, because in the object tab here, we have the density, which is the smoke, temperature, which is the fire, and the velocity, which we actually don't need at all. We have these only being calculated at export. So this is still living on our GPU. It actually doesn't exist in our viewport, just like with the volume builder and the volume mesher. So just like when we were trying to mesh the smoke, we couldn't see it until we offloaded this calculation from our GPU to our CPU, or have it live in our viewport by changing these object properties to on. So you'll still see nothing updated at all, because there's one more step, and that is applying a volume material to this Pyro object. So let's go to our material area here. We're going to go to Create, Redshift Materials, and go down to Pyro Volume. And this is the same as the regular volume, but this is just optimized for Pyro. It already has some of the settings already dialed in. So we'll grab our Pyro volume and we'll apply this to the Pyro object, not the object with the tag. And voila, we now have our VDBs rendered. So this means that whatever third-party renderer you use, as long as it can render VDBs, which most do, like your Octane, your Arnold's, you can render VDBs with literally any render. It doesn't have to be Redshift. So this doesn't exactly look like what we have going on here in our viewport. So we can go ahead and tweak some settings, but The thing I want to show you is that if I'm just kind of moving this around in the viewport, this isn't actually very accurate. This is going to go slow. If I want to see a different frame of my sim, that means I have to like play this back from 0 to see the sim again. So that's kind of the downside of loading this into your viewport. I highly recommend when you're ready to render and you're going to dial in your volume materials that you go ahead and just cache everything out that you need. So for this fire simulation, the most important things that we need to cache is this density and the temperature, okay? We don't really need anything else for the fire and smoke sim, okay? So because we've designated this to only be rendered on export, means we can go into the cache tab and we can cache our scene. Now, you'll want to make sure that you go ahead and rename this something different, because every time you cache this, the default name is going to be simulation scene. So if you had another VDB folder with VDB files named the same thing, you would just overwrite it. So you don't want to do that. So we'll just name this as test. And then what you want to do is, it's very important that you, because VDB files are massive, you want to make sure that you have a hard drive that's fairly beefy. So I have my chunky boy here, which is named chunky because it's about 12.4 terabytes here. So because it is almost 13 terabytes of space, and some of these VDB files can be 300 megabytes a frame, okay? So that'll add up pretty quickly. So I have my chunky boy here, and then I just have a volumes folder, and I'm just gonna place this in here and just hit save. So you can see that a VDB file is created for every single frame to create the animation. That's exactly what we're going to do for this one. And now you can see it's caching, and it's caching fairly quickly. Now, if you have a sim with a very low voxel size like 0.5 or 0.1 or even 0.01, this caching simulation will take a lot longer. But because our voxel sizes are relatively big, this is going to go by pretty dang fast. And this is for 90 frames here as well. So now you'll see that this is now enabled. Here is the file name. And this is a VDB file that you can literally load into any other file. And so if you want to do that, you would just go up to volume and volume loader. And that's where you can go and load up any VDB file. So I can get this blue flame here, open that up. So if I select my volume loader and just scrub ahead, you can see there's the other VDB in the scene, but I'm just going to go ahead and delete that because the only one I need is this one that we generate with the fire. And because we don't need to generate any of this stuff in the viewport anymore, we can just turn this to off, and now we'll only get our cached VDB in our scene, and it just runs super fast. And this runs as fast as it did when it was on the GPU, but now it's actually existing in our viewport because, of course, we cached it. So just zoom in here. You can see that we're seeing a little bit of the voxels here. So we could have done with a smaller voxel size. But again, if you wanted to do that, you would have to go and change the settings and then recache and have this all update and all that good stuff. So let's just work with the settings here and get it to look a little bit more like how it was in the viewport. So I'm just going to open up this Pyro volume here. And here's our settings here. I can close out of that material manager there, get us a little bit more space. So if we look at our material here, you can see it's using channels from the VDB data that we cached out, which if we go to the object tab, we cached out the density and the temperature here. So if we go back to our material, you can see there's the density. If I go to presets, you can see the density and temperature are the two channels that we have saved here that we can load up. So density is plugged into scatter. If we up the scatter, this is going to allow light to scatter through the density, which is the smoke. And you can see if I bring this up to 20, we're allowing a lot more light to scatter through our object. So one thing we can do is we can go down to our absorption, and this is going to allow that density to absorb more light and suck in more light. And so if we bring this up to 20, you can see how it's much, much darker. And this almost looks like, you're burning plastic or a tire or something like that. You're going to have that really dark smoke. So these absorption and scatter coefficients kind of go hand in hand there. Now, if I go all the way down to emission, this controls how much light's emitted from that volume or from this channel, which is the temperature. And remember, temperature is the volume that represents the flame. So if I up the scale here, you can see how this is going to illuminate everything, and it's going to have a lot more emission and really brighten up the smoke. And this just got a little bit brighter there. And then we also have this area down here where it's set to black body emission already, but here we can adjust the temperature. So this is set to 6,500 from the get-go, and you really don't have to stick with that. You can always up this to 12,000, or you can cool this off. And you can see how the temperature isn't very hot at all. So you can see how you can adjust things there. Then this offset just kind of offsets the values there. You can see it's making the darker values brighter. And if we go like 1.2, it's going to make the bright values darker. So typically I don't mess around with this too much unless you really want to just like slightly tweak everything to be a little bit darker, a little bit lighter there. Kind of just remapping those VDB values. Just leave it like that. And this is basically how you can go ahead and just adjust how your volume renders, the colors, all that good stuff. And there's these ramps here as well, which you can really like crush the values here as well. All right, so that is shading some realistic fire, but what if you wanted to push it more mystical, more fantastical fire, like purple, blue flames? Let's go ahead and show you how to do that. All right, so I went ahead and resimmed here. And that's just because I was getting really annoyed with the little blockies, but just to show you that you can get really nice, clean VDBs out of this. You just got to lower those voxel settings here. And then I just simply recached the scene, just wrote over the existing VDB files. And now what I want to do is show you how we can create different stylized looks. So coloring different elements of, say, the flames and the smoke. How can you get like custom colors applied so you get a more stylized look? And so first I'm going to show you how you can get a different fire color. So let's just say you wanted to have, instead of a yellow orange flame, you wanted a blue or purple flame. Make it look a little bit more mystical looking. So to do that and to have a custom fire color, what we're going to do is we're just going to get rid of the density channel altogether because we do not need the smoke. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go down to the absorption here, and we're going to load up the temperature, because again, temperature holds all of the fire data. So we'll load that up, and now we just have the fire without the smoke, which is really, really awesome. Now, another thing we can do is we can have the temperature in the emission here, and we can also plug this into the color channel. So we're putting in the temperature in the emission color channel here. And instead of using the realistic black body emission mode, we're going to use a color ramp. And what that's going to do is going to allow us to remap the colors of the emission to whatever we want using this ramp. So we're going to leave this leftmost color chip black, and we can even move this in a little bit to kind of clamp things. You can see that clamped the lighter values there. And now I can just click and make a new color chip, and let's make this purple. Boom. Purple flame. Now we can just, again, clamp this in again. You can change this color here to, let's go blue. You can see what that looks like. And we can bring down the overall scale of that emission to maybe make it a little bit less bright. We can also give this an overall tint. So if we want some purple tint to this as well, you can see what that looks like. And that actually doesn't look all that great. So let's lighten that color a little bit. You notice sometimes you need to like tweak the settings a little bit to get it to update. There we go. That's looking pretty cool. Like that's a nice stylized little flame we got going on there. Again, if we want to clamp out some of these other values, let's bring this to the right there. And so this almost looks like, ink. And it's going to be super fun to see what people come up with to create these kind of like stylized looks. So as easy as it was to create some of that really stylized looking colorful fire, we can do the same thing with smoke. So that was setting a custom color for fire, but what about this scene we had before where we have that billowing smoke kind of meeting in the middle and kind of mixing together. How can we get these colors to actually render in our viewport here? So again, we're going to go make sure we're in the Redshift render here. We're going to create a Pyro volume. We're going to apply that to our Pyro. And I'm also going to make sure that I have this cache, and I already did this previously, so I'm just going to enable that cache. And you'll see that when you actually cache out, it's going to remove all that color information from the VDB there. But the one important thing to cache out when you have colored density or colored smoke is you want to make sure you also export out the color information here. Typically, by default, you have the density, temperature, and velocity. But because we only want to create colored smoke, we're going to get the density and then the color of that density. So make sure that you export both of those out when you go and cache, because now when I go and hit play to render this, you can see that. Let me just turn on some area lights in here, get a dome light. You can see this is looking pretty nice, very dramatic looking. But you can see that the color information is not there. Now we cached it out because we exported using this color. So we need to do one step to bring in that color information that we set in the actual Pyro tags. You can see the color set there and the blue color set there. Let's translate that over to the Pyro volume here. So to get the color, the only thing you need to do is you need to go down to the absorption here. And for the color channel, you're going to go to presets, Pyro, and there's that color information that we exported out. And once I load that up, voila, we got our blue and our pink colors showing through. Now this is pretty washed out. So we can go and bring up the absorption coefficient, which is going to allow more light to be absorbed, and this should bring out more of that color. And this looks really nice and bright. And we can even bring down the scatter so this will look less bright. So you can see what's going on there, maybe 0.35. But the higher this absorption coefficient, the deeper the color you can get. And again, this is a back and forth game, or if you want to up the absorption, you can also up the scatter like so. Now, if you actually want custom colors and totally override the colors that we exported out in the VDB data, we can go down to absorption, and instead of color in the color channel, we can load up density. You can see now we're back to where we were before, where it's just gray. But what we can do is just what we did with our colored flame, our blue flame, is we can remap it using this ramp. So I can double click here, and let's bring in, let's do all purple. And you can see how dark that is. That absorption coefficient's pretty deep there. Let's bring up maybe the scatter coefficient to 3 so we get a little bit more light scattering through that volume. So we can even go in here and load a rainbow preset in there. And you'll see that the only thing that's really getting represented is the blue here. So we're just going to remove that rightmost color chip. Make sure black is on the totally left side here. So if we remove that, you'll see that things will get a little wonky. So I'll undo that. So then I'll select all these colors by selecting the leftmost chip, holding shift down, and selecting the rightmost color chip and just pushing these inwards. Maybe bring down the absorption. And now you can start to see all of those crazy colors getting represented in this volume here. And it almost looks like a clown wig or something like that. Spread this out a little bit more. So this is looking kind of trippy. We can go and remove some of these color chips here and maybe just have that purple and blue. Let's bring down the scatter coefficient, 0.5. We can even bring this left chip in to kind of remove the whiter bits of the smoke. A lot of push and pull between the scatter and the absorption, and adjusting the color chips so these colors actually come through. You can even go in here and colorize the absorption color. So what's the color that gets absorbed and that you can see in there? So this actually works a little bit better than this below, but you can actually see how you can mix the colors in this ramp and the colors in this ramp and kind of get some really cool looks going on here. Pretty sweet. So as a first iteration of this new fire simulation system, I think Maxon knocked it out of the park, adding in that little C4D-ness I talked about earlier. It's so easy to be able to create these very complex and beautiful looking fire simulations. And for anyone coming from X-Particles or Houdini, I think you might be impressed with the performance and the integration with the existing C4D toolset. And I think with just a nice particle system, new updated particle system in there, I think that might push everyone over the edge. I mean, if you think about it, this whole new revamped particle-based simulation system's only been around for about a year or so, so it's in its infancy, and I'm really excited to see where Maxon takes this whole thing. The fact that it's so easy to use and integrated with the volume mesher, the forces, field forces, MoGraph, I think is enough reason for anyone to give this a try. But I will say this is V1, so it is a little bit buggy. I've had a lot of VRAM issues. The Pyro system is a VRAM hog right now, and unfortunately, you can only run this simulation system on a single GPU. So if you have dual GPU setups like I do here, I have dual 3090s, it's only using one. So I hope that is addressed in the future, as well as maybe condensing that list of settings that just go for days and days and days. So what do you think about Pyro? Does it replace Turbulence FD or X-Particles or Embergen for you? Leave a comment with your thoughts and let us know if you're playing around with it so far or what your impressions are with what you've been seeing all over the internet with people getting their hands on this new Pyro system. All right, it's getting hot in here, so I'm gonna go cool off. Until next time, go out and create something. See you next time.